happens during the New Deal is based on economic theory put forward by a man named John Maynard Keynes. And Keynes' economics is based on this idea that what a government ought to do was engage in vast spending during times of recession or depression, and then when the economy recovers, the government should reduce spending to balance the budget. So in other words, it should do exactly opposite of what people felt was the right way to go. What had been traditional was when the economy started to fall, then they would cut budgets to stay within their tax revenues. Keynes argued that you should do exactly the opposite. Now, Keynes is going to visit FDR in 1934, and he's going to often advise American government officials. Now, like a lot of people, FDR was confused by the math and couldn't follow it because it's pretty high level, pretty complicated stuff. But Keynes is going to win a lot of converts in the U.S. government. And what we're going to see is FDR is going to be most successful when he used deficit spending, and his biggest failures are going to be when he tries to balance the budget. Now, FDR, remember, did run on a campaign of ending the Depression, and he's trying to package his ideas in terms of restoring faith in the economy or in the government. And he's really the first president to make really good use of radio. He's the first what we call soundbite president. There's a lot of little famous blurbs that come out of FDR's mouth, like the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, or a date which will live in infamy. Now, he is going to hold what he calls fireside chats, which are where he's going to use the radio to explain some new government program in simple terms that are going to be generally accessible to the American people. So he's the first president who's really tried to directly communicate with the populace. So, the first New Deal, we need to understand some things. What it wasn't was a clear strategy or shaped by a single philosophy. What it was FDR trying to use a variety of approaches to see what worked, and he was simply being pragmatic. But what it does is it changes the role of the government, and it makes the government responsible for managing the economy. Now, New Deal programs went into three stages: relief, recovery, and reform. Relief was designed to help people right now, while recovery was designed to restore the economy, and reform were measures that were aimed at making sure it never happened again. Now, the result of this was what they call the alphabetical agencies that are going to be designed to stimulate the economy. And what we're going to see throughout this lecture is there's a lot of different agencies who typically have three-letter names. Now, there's a particularly important phenomenon with the FDR presidency, which is called the first 100 days. Now, out of FDR's landslide and most of the country demanding action, FDR is able to do an unprecedented amount of things in his first 100 days in office. During that time, he's going to focus on relief, and he's going to do so by issuing an unprecedented number of executive orders. Congress is going to support every piece of legislation he proposes. Congress is only going to pass a small number of bills over his objections, and he's going to have a level of presidential activity that has never been seen before or since. And that, importantly at the time, is going to stand in very clear contrast to what Hoover had done during his 4 years. Now, his first target is the banking crisis. And remember, Hoover had done nothing during the lame duck period, so FDR does something drastic. In order to deal with the banking crisis, he closes all of the banks. And banks are only allowed to reopen when they have a Treasury Department permission to do so. Now, FDR is also going to authorize the Federal Reserve to make unsecured loans to banks. And this is something that the Federal Reserve had never done before. What this does is this creates what we call de facto deposit insurance. Because prior to this, banks could only borrow from the federal government based on having collateral. Now, banks can borrow an unlimited amount of money, which means that the banks, in essence, can never go broke because they have the resources of the federal government backing them. Now, shortly thereafter, this is put into law with mechanisms that allow the government to step in and regulate a bank that's doing very poorly. It's called the FDIC. Now, FDR objected to this, but the Congress is going to feel it's very important to go ahead and do it anyway. Now, what's important is when these banks are closed and they all have to clean up their books and make sure they have adequate cash on hand and go through Treasury Department permission to reopen, when they do reopen with that official government stamp of approval, people start putting their money back in the bank rather than hiding under their mattresses or coffee cans in the backyard because they have the federal government guarantee that that bank is sound. And so billions are going to be re-injected into banks. One of the big problems for banks was they didn't have enough hard currency because people were hoarding it because they were afraid if they put it in the bank, it wouldn't be there when they needed it because of all the bank failures. Now they're putting all their money back in, and that's meaning these banks now have access to all those deposits. They really don't have to borrow very much from the federal government, but that guarantee they can when they need to is what it takes to restore faith in the banks. Now, also during the first 100 days, importantly, FDR is going to suspend the gold standard, and he's going to require people to exchange their gold for greenbacks, and he's going to demonetize gold. So in other words, he's going to go from having money that's based on redeemable value in gold to essentially monopoly money, because that allows the federal government to change the money supply to meet market conditions and use it to help stimulate the economy when they change supply very strategically. FDR is also going to force small banks to consolidate, and he's going to form the Securities Exchange Commission to police the stock market. He's also going to balance the budget by cutting the salaries of government employees and also veterans' pensions. And importantly, FDR is also going to repeal prohibition, which is going to allow him to now bring back legal alcohol and, very importantly, tax that legal alcohol to obtain a source of income for the government. One of FDR's other early plans is the Agricultural Adjustment Agency, or AAA. And what they're going to do is they're going to allow food producers to decide on a market price, and government will then regulate production in order to get that price to where the farmers need it to be. Now, this means they're going to have to pay some farmers to keep fields fallow, and they're going to pay that by putting taxes on food processing. So this means that the actual price being paid for the wheat and so on is going to be at a level farmers can afford. That's going to be paid for example, by taxes made on milling that wheat into flour. Now, what they're going to do is they're going to use these government payments to keep people from actually farming up to a point of parity, which means the point where farmers can pay their bills. And this is going to result in farm income increasing by 50%. Now, this is going to favor large farmers over small farmers, and it's going to provide no incentive to end the evictions of tenant farmers or to stop firing farm hands. But what it's going to do is it's going to allow farmers to produce food at a price that they can actually afford and stabilize the agricultural market. Now, this is going to be struck down by the Supreme Court as illegal, but it's going to come back under a new name as soil conservation, which is going to pay people to plant non-market crops and then burn them in the field as a method to restore the soil, is how they're pitching it. At that point, the Supreme Court doesn't interfere for reasons we'll get to in a subsequent lecture. Now, another attempt FDR makes to help farmers is the Resettlement Administration that becomes renamed the Farm Security Administration. Now, the FSA is going to provide loans to assist farmers to relocate from submarginal land to better areas. In other words, if you're sitting on land with poor soil and you can't really grow a good crop, they'll give you a loan so you can buy a different farm and start over. Now, that's not going to have a really wide impact, but what the FSA is going to do is they're going to bring in rural electrification starting in about 1935, and they're reasonably successful in bringing in that infrastructure to a large amount of the country. And that's going to be something that derives economic benefit really right down to this day, is that every time they went out and brought in power lines, that allowed businesses and factories and so on to actually open up in places they never could before. One of FDR's other big important programs is the TVA, or the Tennessee Valley Authority, and that's going to be created by a congressional charter in May 1933. And what this is aimed at is trying to provide relief to the poorest place in America at the time. Now, the Tennessee Valley was in the following conditions: 30% were affected by malaria. The average income was $639 per year, when $1,500 per year is a living wage. Some families in the Tennessee Valley were living on as little as $100 per year. A lot of the farmland was depleted, and the area was prone for flooding. So this is an area where disease and poverty is just rampant, and that has no chance of recovery on its own. Now, here we have a picture taken early on by one of the TVA workers, and you can get a sense of just the level of poverty we're talking about here. Now, this is going to result in major intervention in this area in terms of navigation and flood control on the rivers. They're going to build electricity generation and supply a lot of hydroelectric power. They're going to bring in fertilizer manufacturing plants. They're going to engage in widespread economic development throughout the Tennessee Valley, and they're going to implement new farming methods. Now, we have to understand that the people that lived there were often opposed to this and very proud people, and they're going to face a lot of local opposition at first, especially when they came in and moved people off their land because they had decided to flood some particular area of the valley for example, build a hydroelectric plant. So the TVA did a lot of economic good, provide a lot of stimulation, but also met a lot of local opposition. Now, here's a map of just exactly what's involved in the TVA, so you can see that it goes across several states and across a giant watershed right there just to the east of the Mississippi. Now, one thing that I want to point out to you is going to come up again in a later lecture is, importantly, there's a lot of investment in hydroelectric power, and a really important place during World War II is Oak Ridge and that becomes one of the places that's involved in the Manhattan Project and the development of the nuclear bomb. So we're going from one of the poorest places on Earth to one of the most developed places when it comes to electricity and power generation. Now, in addition to the TVA, there's also the NRA and the PWA, and they're both going to be created by the National Industrial Recovery Act, and they're going to do different things because, again, there's a lot of these alphabetical agencies as they're known. Now, the NRA's job is going to be to increase consumer purchasing power, and they're going to try to work with business to end child labor, establish minimum wage, establish a 35 to 40-hour work week. They're going to draft codes to regulate business, and this ultimately becomes a failing experiment when it is struck down by the Supreme Court. And this is a form of sort of soft government intervention because they're working with business rather than mandating that business do. So it really wasn't getting very far. And it turned out to be something the Supreme Court judged was illegal. So once they do so, they're really not going to try to revive this program. Now, the PWA is going to be designed to fund public works, but it really takes until 1938 to get those public works off the ground, so the PWA isn't very successful there. And likewise, they were trying to help unions through cooperative measures that had no teeth, and they also generally failed. The program that's very important during this time period is the Civil Works Administration. And it's intended to pump money into the economy. And what they're going to do is going to pay people to work, and for the CWA, paying people to work is more important than what they were doing. So they're going to put 4 million people to work on temporary projects, some of which included schools, parks, and roads. But a lot of the projects were fairly pointless and intended to do nothing more than create jobs. They built a lot of roads to nowhere. Now, unfortunately, these are temporary projects, and they don't have a lot of long-term strategic goals in mind. So when the project is over, those people are back out of work. They're not really things that are going to derive long-term economic benefit, except things like the schools and some of the roads they built. So there really is not a strategic approach, and the CWA is just kind of floundering. But importantly, it's putting people back to work. So it is providing some benefit in terms of some income to about 4 million people at different times. Now, the last of the alphabetical agencies we need to know from the first New Deal, and the most important one to remember by far, is the CCC, or Civil Conservation Corps. And this has been something that FDR had tried as governor of New York. And what they're going to do is they're going to pay young men to live in camps and plant trees, dig irrigation, and engage in a lot of tasks related to forest management. And this becomes the first attempt to develop forests as a resource for long-term benefit of the country. And we have to keep in mind that the country as a whole had been experiencing deforestation since the beginning of colonization. So now is the first time the government's going to come in and really engage in work to restore those forests and to make sure they're there for generations to come, because timber is a very valuable resource, and the government is going to step in with the CCC and look at managing that resource for future generations. And what makes the CCC very important is not only does it put a huge number of people to work, it's probably one of the agencies that has the biggest and best long-term vision for what American resources and economy are going to look like in the future. Here we have a quick map, and what you can see is where the CCC camps were during this time period. And you can see there's really right around rivers and areas where there's still quite a bit of forest, and throughout the country, and there's a lot of camps there. There were a lot of people were put to work on these projects. So what's the big idea here? Well, first and foremost, FDR wants to keep farmers on their land. He also wants to engage in some long-term economic development policies like the TVA. Now, the public works programs that are going to be there are going to be designed to get people back to work, but they're slow to get going and not strategic. And remember the CCC and the TVA if you can remember no other agencies from the first New Deal. They're the two most important by a long shot. Now, what you really should understand about the New Deal is FDR is going to try a lot of things, and not all of it worked. But what's important to Americans is FDR was doing something, and FDR was trying. And even if it didn't always succeed, it was still a big improvement over what Hoover had done. See you in the next lecture.